Today at Speedy's Garage, we're going to be working on a bit of a pet project. A couple of years ago at Challenger Fest, one of the guys that attends brought some electric coolers with him. And they ended up being very popular, and the following year he donated one to be auctioned off with the proceeds going to Racing for Vets, our official event charity. That has kind of taken on a life of its own, and this year that cooler was brought back and redonated at Challenger Fest 6 to bring in even more money for Racing for Vets. So now we're going to look at doing some upgrades and potentially taking this up a notch. I did some online searches, and my thoughts were if an electric cooler is fun, a gas-powered one would be awesome. So I found crazycoolers.com online and contacted those guys to get one of their units to have a look at. And this one is actually a gas-powered 4-cycle overhead valve powered cooler. The unit arrived very well packaged and quickly. Just took a couple of days to get it. It's actually double boxed with plenty of packing protection. The cooler comes with two versions of instructions. Kind of a quick version, which is in color and on nice printed paper. It goes through the highlights, and then a much more in-depth version. It's actually well written and easy to follow and shouldn't be too difficult. Lots of pictures. To assemble this bad boy, I'm going to use my low-power DeWalt impact. This is optional. You can obviously do this with just socket wrenches or box-end wrenches. You will need a 5mm and a 2.5mm Allen wrench, Phillips head screwdriver, an assortment of sockets. You're going to need 8, 10, 13, 14, 17, 19, and 22 is the big one. That's for the axles. A little lubricant, possibly a rag. Maybe the instructions, maybe not. We'll see how it goes. If it has some tips in there, I might use them, but I'm pretty good at putting stuff together. And of course, some tunes. Okay, I started by flipping the cooler up on its back and put a microfiber towel into the motor to protect it. I then connected the spindles to the front using the kingpins. I did use a little white lithium grease in the runners there so that it gives a nice smooth operation for the steering. This is a 19mm bolt. It is a lock nut, so you'll need a wrench on the top to snug these down. You don't want to make them too tight because the arm there will collapse and it'll make it too tight against the spindle. So just snug it up. Then insert your steering shaft, and there's a little bit of grease in this too, but again I sprayed white lithium in there and also smeared some on the steering collar itself. And then you just install your 8mm hex bolt. Found out this one's actually 8. The instructions didn't say you needed one of these, but they probably changed hardware over time. And tighten the 12mm lock nut on the other side. So now the steering assembly is good. Keep an eye on your cable routing because you'll need to tidy that up when we're finished installing everything. And now it's time for the front tires and wheels. When installing the front wheels, I use a little bit of thick grease. It's called Judy butter is the kind I had on hand, but anything that's kind of thick will work. And I don't know that it's necessary, but I smeared just a little bit on the axle shaft just to make sure I had really smooth operation. When you put the wheel on, the wheel will go over the axle, then you got a washer that'll go on, and then finally your lock nut, and that's a 22mm. And pay attention to your wheels. It should be pretty obvious, but the fronts just have a bearing. The rears have a spline. And you want to be careful when you're putting the wheels on. Make sure that your valve stems face out so you can air them up when needed. You don't want to tighten these too tight. Again, just snug them. The next thing we want to do is set the front wheel alignment, and you do that with the tie rods here. Back your lock nuts off if they happen to be tightened up. It's got a flat in it that takes a 10mm wrench if you happen to need that, but mine's fine to just turn it by hand. And you want to turn it until the wheel is either straight up and down to the body or maybe even angled out just a degree or two. Once you have it set, spin your lock nuts, and they are 12 millimeter. And then just give them snug them up. Here's where I'm gonna need the 10 millimeter wrench. There's that one. There's that one. When setting your alignment, be sure to do so with the handlebars perfectly straight. And on the kingpins, you know you have them tight enough when you turn the wheels and the kingpin stays still. Nice smooth movement, but the kingpin doesn't move. Next, I prop the cooler up on the handlebars using some wood blocks and a microfiber towel. And just be careful because it will want to sway back and forth a little bit on the steering. So make sure it's nice and stable before you start the work on the back axle. Okay, you're going to start by attaching the brake caliper. And it sits on the outside of the brake caliper bracket. There's two 5 millimeter hex bolts, and you just want to put them on finger tight so the brake caliper can kind of wiggle around. And then you take your rear axle and you set it up on the frame, and it's got two 10 millimeter nut and 13 millimeter bolt on each side that hold the axle in place where the bearing is. And you want to slide the bearings in all the way to the center of the axle when you're putting it on, that way everything fits properly. You'll have to wiggle the brake rotor into the brake caliper, and it'll be a little snug, and you can use these adjustment screws to give you some room and move the brake caliper around until you can get it fitted. And it's dragging a little bit. There's a lot of adjustment in the brake caliper to get that set up properly, but we're going to come back to that in a bit. Once you have that all set up, just tighten the 4 bolts and your rear axle is installed. Well, I've got it in this position. Now's a good time to remove the throttle stop. So just take the two 10 millimeter bolts out that hold the gas tank on. And with those 10 millimeter bolts out of the way, you can just wiggle the gas tank off the bracket and set it to the side. Just be careful, don't unhook the vent tube down here, or the tube to the motor rather. And what we're after is this throttle stop right here. And if you actuate the throttle, which is a thumb throttle and it's metal, that's pretty nice actually. What you can see is it's limiting throttle travel. Now this is good if you have kids or something. This unit isn't recommended for people under 18 years of age, but this is the United States of America and we grew up on this kind of stuff, so if I had kids they'd definitely be riding one. But I'd probably have it limited like that is to about 30 or 40% throttle so that they would be less likely to hurt themselves. For us, we want that gone because I want 100% throttle. And it's just a Phillips head screw. You remove that throttle stop and put the screw back in place, and then you'll get full power. Much better. Now, just reinstall the gas tank. Make sure your rubber bumper is on the mounting bracket to protect the tank itself. Line it up with the 10 millimeter bolt holes and make sure you've got your grommets attached to your bolts. And these you want to be careful with. The gas tank is like a polypropylene plastic material, so you don't want to over tighten it and crack it. Just snug it up. The next thing we need to do is align the sprocket with the shaft of the engine. This is the drive sprocket, so you want the chain to be in alignment so you don't have any chain problems. And as you can see, this one's about 1/4 of an inch off. We've got a good straight edge on there. The adjustment is very easy. There's a lock nut down here that you back off, and then it's a 5 millimeter locking hex bolt. So we loosen that, and then we just inch the drive sprocket over until the straight edge almost touches the teeth on the engine shaft. Pretty close, and a little bit more. That's about as close as we're going to get right there. Now I'm just going to lock the sprocket back in place. This is an important part, so take your time, make sure you get it right. Oops. And once you've tightened everything, recheck. And we are just about perfect. Next, we want to adjust the rear disc brake. And you do that by loosening the 10mm lock nut and 5mm lock bolt on the rotor assembly. You back these float screws out on the caliper all the way out until they stop. There's two of them, one on the top, one on the bottom. And then turn them in about a turn and a half to get the caliper alignment lined up on the rotor. And with this loose, turn the axle a few times and the rotor will self-adjust to the caliper. Once you have it where it's barely dragging, grab the front brake and retighten the lock screw. With it tightened, come back and hit your 10mm lock nut. And that's all there is to it, to getting the brakes set up. Okay, with the sprockets aligned, now we just need to install the drive chain. Start by going around the engine side, underneath the little tensioner, and go ahead and loosen it so it can move freely. Loosen the 4 bolts that hold the engine to the mounting plate and push the engine 100% forward. And then just start the chain on the sprocket and roll it, and it'll line up and hop on the teeth. Okay, now that you get the chain installed, you need to put the proper tension on it using the engine mounting bolts. So you have them loose enough so that the engine can move, and you have to you're probably gonna need a helper for this. I had to have my wife come out and help me, but you pull back on the engine to put tension on the chain and then start to snug the bolts and check tension. You want it tight, but not fiddle tight. Once you have it, where you get about that much slack in the chain, give it a couple of spins and make sure it feels like it's aligned. On mine, I actually had to take off this little pulley, and there were 3 washers on the back. I removed 2 of them because it had spaced this pulley out too far and just left the one, and with one on there, it's just about perfect. When you've got it set where you need it to be, go ahead and snug up and tighten all 4 engine mounting bolts, and you're ready to go to the next step. Next, just want to install the rear wheels. Remember, they're the ones with the splines. And I did put just a little bit of grease on the axle splines just to protect it. So I have that in place, and it's a 22mm bolt that holds them on. Start it by hand, hit with the impact. Looks good. Next, we're going to install the chain guard. And one of the nice things I've found when putting this unit together is they actually put the bolts in the part for you, so you know what goes where. It's not like you get a big bag of hardware and you have to figure out where everything goes. That's actually a very nice touch on something like this. And to install the chain guard, it's just a 10mm lock nut on the back and a 5mm hex bolt on the front. It's got a rubber washer between the shield and the mounting bracket. You want to make sure you use that. It'll keep everything nice and quiet. And you also want to make sure to bend the bracket so that everything's in place and that the chain is 100% covered. Next, just install the footrest mounts, which is just a 10mm nut and a 8mm bolt. And if these are a little snug, you can use a rubber mallet. Like I said, the power coating on this unit is actually quite thick. So if some of these won't slide together, just give it a little tap, or if the bolts won't go in, just give them a little tap with a rubber mallet. Fix that right up. Then install the footrests, and they are a 5mm hex bolt and a 10mm nut. There's 4 of those, 2 on the front and 2 on the back. And finally, just install the front and rear splash shields, and they're also held on with 5mm hex nuts and a 10mm bolt on the back. And these are plastic, so be careful, don't tighten them up too tight. Just snug them down so you don't break anything. Now that assembly is pretty much complete, we just need to adjust the brakes one final time. And that's done with this lock nut and 2.5mm Allen screw. So you release the lock nut and start to adjust this Allen screw until you just barely get any drag on the brake rotor, brake disc. Once you have that, you should be able to squeeze the brake handle and only move it about 1/8 of an inch, or 1/8 of the travel rather, and the brakes will engage, and they're actually quite powerful. I was actually surprised at how strong the brakes are. So once you have that adjusted, you can move on to the next step. Okay, the last thing I did was tidy up the front cables with some zip ties. I set the kill switch and the brake lever and the throttle where they were comfortable in my hands. There's just a small 3mm Allen screw here, a 10mm bolt on the throttle, and that's actually a metal throttle. I was surprised at that. Expect it to be plastic. And then the brake lever actually has a Phillips head screw that you use to adjust the position of that. And like I already discussed, I adjusted the brakes so that they come on pretty hard. You want to be able to stop this thing, obviously. And finally, the last thing you want to do, fill it up with some 5W30 synthetic oil. I'm going to use Pennzoil Platinum. It's what I like. It doesn't take very much. The motor, I think I said it was a 1 horsepower at the beginning of this video, but it's actually a 2 horsepower, a 49cc 4-cycle engine. It probably takes about 8 ounces, 5 ounces of oil. Because of the way the cooler sits, I'm going to tip it up on its back, fill it with oil, then set it down. Any extra will spill out. So be sure to have a cup to catch that. And they say you want it right to the top of the oil filler neck, just past the opening, and that's how you know you have enough in it. After trying to put oil in the engine on its back, I had trouble getting a funnel between the engine and the cooler. So it was easier just to remove the 4 hex Allen bolts that are 8mm and use a measuring cup to fill. Hey, beautiful.
Is that my measuring cup?
Maybe.
It's washed in it.
Okay. To take a measuring cup and fill the engine with oil this way. I could see when it was almost to the edge of the cap here, and then when it started to trickle out, I just capped it off and wiped off the excess. And that way I know the engine has enough oil. That was Miss Speedy, by the way. There are a couple of final adjustments to make before firing the engine for the first time. You've got a idle set screw here. And you're going to want to make sure that your throttle cable has enough play in it to allow the throttle stop for idle to come back to touch that screw. If it does not, you can use this little section right here, and I had to roll mine all the way back. So you take off the Phillips head screw, and then you roll back your lock nut, and then the bracket will actually thread back on this shaft to get all the way back to there. And if it's still not enough, you can always bend this forward a little bit, but I had to move mine some to make it have enough room to where the idle screw was against the throttle stop so I can set the idle. And as part of that, if you look up front where the throttle assembly is, there's a cable that comes in. There's a throttle adjustment here as well, and I had to roll mine all the way back on that one also. And it's got a nice rubber boot that covers it up and protects it. And to get to the carburetor to adjust all of this, it's just the 2 10mm bolts we saw earlier to set the gas tank out of the way. And the last thing I checked was the spark plug gap, and I also put a little bit of anti-seize on that spark plug to make sure I don't have any problems with it in the future. And the proper gap is 0.024 to 0.028 inches. I set mine to 0.026, right in the middle. And like any small engine, there is a choke. On this one, it's labeled on the air cleaner cover, but you might not be able to see it too well. On this one, to the left is choke, and to the right is no choke. But cross-check yours to make sure it matches. And with all that done, we're ready to fire it up and set the idle speed. Now, when the first time you start it, it might have a high idle, so make sure you have your hand on the brake just in case. That sounds pretty good. So you want it to have the lowest idle it can have, yet still idle solid. Sounds about right there. And this is amazingly quiet. I mean, I'm right by the engine, and it's actually a really quiet unit. Well, now that we got the idle set, let's go for a test ride. To give this cooler a thorough test, we've turned it over to our not-so-tame racing driver. Some say his breath smells of 109 octane race fuel, and that he can only speak in binary. All we know is, he's called the Stig's third cousin twice removed. So on a scale of 1 to 10, as far as fun factor goes, I give this thing a 12. I seriously have not had this much fun on something since I was about 8 or 9 years old, riding around on a 70cc Honda three-wheeler. As I've mentioned, the quality is very high, and you get a lot of features for the money. There's even some accessories you can use to make it more user-friendly, like a cup holder. They have a external light for if you're going to use it at night. There's a seat cushion available if you decide you want something like that as well. I've run one tank of 87 octane fuel out of the gas pump through the cooler and didn't have any issues. However, the instructions indicate that fuel that contains ethanol could cause long-term issues if you store the cooler or have any performance problems. So I went to Home Depot and picked up some of this True Fuel. It's a 92 octane fuel product, and it doesn't contain any ethanol. I got a little bit better performance out of the cooler using this fuel, and so this is what I plan to run in mine. It's cheap, easy to get, and effectively cheap insurance. Crazy Coolers and I have partnered together in order to help the official event charity for Challenger Fest 7, which will take place in April of 2016. If we sell 10 coolers under discount code Speedy's Garage, and there'll be a place on the Crazy Cooler website to enter that discount code in, www.crazycoolers.com. And if we sell 10 units, they will donate a Crazy Cooler to be auctioned off, with 100% of the proceeds going to our official event charity, Racing for Vets, who aim to help service-wounded veterans reclaim their lives. I'll have a link on my website, as well as the description of this YouTube video, for how to take advantage of the Crazy Cooler discount using the Speedy's Garage discount code. So that's it for phase 1 of the Crazy Cooler project. But as you know, we modify everything at Speedy's Garage, so stay tuned for some modifications I have lined up for this cooler. If you want to see those and more information on modifications we perform, visit our website, www.speedysgarage.net.